morning again, Green Spring. I hope you didn't mind waking up to just a little snow. At least it's not as much as some were predicting, so maybe we're lucky. Today I have Betty Christnan as the guest on Who's Who, and she has led a very interesting life. I think you'll enjoy our next 28 minutes. Betty came to Green Spring in 2014. She lives in Oak Hill, and she was elected to the council a year ago.
Last year. Mm-hmm.
And last year she was on the resident, she was the liaison to the Resident Life Committee. And this year she's the vice president with Peggy Kellers as president. So welcome, Betty. It's a pleasure to have you on the show.
Thank you, Gray. It's good to be here.
And tell us a little bit about your early life. Where were you born and what did you do and so forth?
Well, I was born in Minneapolis, Minnesota. Grew up in Coon Rapids, which is a suburb of Minneapolis. And I went to school throughout elementary, junior high, senior high in either Coon Rapids or Anoka, Minnesota.
Now, Anoka, that's an Indian name, right?
Yes, it is.
Okay.
Uh-huh.
Is that close? The Little House on the Prairie? The husband, he came from Minneapolis. Is that? Do you know where?
I think he was more southern Minnesota.
More southern Minnesota?
Uh-huh.
Okay.
Yes.
Okay. All right. So, anything special about high school?
Well, as many of you may know from listening to Prairie Home Companion, Anoka is the mythical town for Lake Wobegon. Ah. And Lake Wobegon was where all the women are strong, all the men are good looking, and all the children are above average, which I find kind of interesting. That phrase comes from Garrison Keillor, who I went to school with. He was 2 years ahead of me in high school.
Is that right?
Yes.
Well, can you describe Garrison a little bit?
Well, he certainly wasn't good looking. At that
wasn't
point,
from Lake Wobegon. Huh?
No, I don't think he was. At that point, he was very tall and skinny and gangly. Oh, okay. And he wrote for the school newspaper, and he hung around with a photographer who also worked for the paper. You know, Garrison is he's about 6'6".
Oh, is he?
And the guy he worked with was about 5'4", so to see them walking around was really very comical.
Yeah.
Because
Jeff, huh?
This poor little guy had, camera bags and stuff on him, and all Garrison had was a notebook and a pencil.
Yeah. Okay, so you went then to college?
Yes, I went into University of Minnesota after I graduated and spent 2 years there. I met my husband while I was at University of Minnesota, and when he graduated, he was going into the military, and we decided to get married. So I was married before I completed
You had Garrison Keillor in high school. Did he also go to University of Minnesota?
Yes, he was at University of Minnesota.
Okay. So you met Dan then, and he he must have been an ROTC.
Yes, he was. Uh-huh.
Okay.
Yeah.
So he graduated, and what branch of the Army did he go into?
He went into intelligence.
Oh.
And his first assignment was training at Fort Benning, Georgia, for the Infantry Officers Basic Course. From there, we went to Fort Holabird, Maryland, which is in Baltimore.
Now, Fort Holabird, that's an intelligence school, isn't it?
It was. It's no longer.
It's no longer there.
There at all.
Yeah.
It's in Dundalk, so it was. The Lever Brothers plant was there, and you could smell all the soaps being made and that kind of thing. But we were there for a few months, and then we went to Fort Hood, Texas. Yeah. We were there a short while, went to Fort McClellan, Georgia for some additional training.
Yeah, these were all different.
It was just schooling.
Yeah.
His first 2 years were primarily schooling.
But then after the first 2 years, he went to the language school, right?
Just at the end, he went to Monterey, California for the Defense Language School, and he studied Bulgarian for a year.
Was he familiar with any other languages?
He spoke some German at home, and he had taken German in college, so he was also, fairly proficient in German.
So the first major assignment was Frankfurt, huh?
Yes, that was our first assignment after the language school, and it was, you fill out a dream sheet.
Yeah.
And that was number one on our dream sheet, and fortunately we got it.
Now, Frankfurt is was it the Corps headquarters? Is that?
That's 5th Corps. But he was stationed in a town called Oberrussel, which is outside of Frankfurt. And the post we were at was called Camp King, and it was an intelligence post. And we were there for about 18 months.
And then you?
He was curtailed for Vietnam.
Okay.
So we came back to the States. We went back to Fort Holabird again for a very short intel course before he went over to Vietnam. We had 2 children at that point, and the kids and I went back to Minneapolis to live while he was in Vietnam.
We didn't talk about your kids, but you have 2 children.
2 children,
What are they?
We have a boy and a girl. Craig was born in Fort Ord while we were in California, and Marie was born in Baltimore just before he went to Vietnam.
Okay. And they live around here?
Yes, they do.
Okay.
Our son and his family are in Clifton, and my daughter and her son are in Alexandria. So they're very close.
Okay, let's go back to Vietnam then.
Yeah. He went to Vietnam.
And you went to
for a year course. I went back to Minneapolis. We rented a small house, and the 2 kids and I lived near family.
Yeah.
And
now, my wife went to Stewart Field, where there was a waiting wives group. Actually, 125 houses were set aside for waiting wives at that time. Stewart had just closed down. Was there, did you have a waiting wives group?
There was a waiting wives group in Minneapolis, and it was very, very active.
How many were there?
Probably about 50 wives.
Okay.
Yeah.
So you all were very close then?
Yes, we had meetings regularly, met for coffee, just play dates with the children. We kept as active as we could.
Kept each other informed about what husbands were
what
doing.
was going on. It wasn't like today where you watch the news and know almost instantaneously what's happening.
Yeah.
So, it was very stressful not knowing. You knew there were things going on, but you didn't hear about them in the paper until sometime afterwards.
Well, after Vietnam, back to Holabird
Back to Fort Holabird for a career course that was a year long, so we were there for another year. And then again, we were reassigned back to Germany. And this time we went to Bremerhaven, which is a port city in northern Germany, and we were there for 3 years.
3 years, okay.
Yeah.
And did you do anything special there?
It was a good place to raise children because it was very, very small. I was active in the Wives Club. I played a lot of bridge because there's not a whole lot to do up there.
Do you play bridge here?
No, I don't. I just haven't gotten back into it. I was playing bridge probably 4 or 5 times a week. Yeah. And when you play that often, you burn out.
Do you? I haven't noticed.
So I haven't played too much bridge since then.
Yeah.
But I was active in the Officers' Wives Club. I was elected the president for the final year that we were there. And it was a good exposure to, what needed to be done in the military communities overseas.
Yeah. I always found the wives clubs to be a very important part of the post.
They are, exactly.
Okay, so from Bremerhaven you went to Nuremberg.
Yes, We moved from Bremerhaven to Nuremberg and spent 2 years in Nuremberg. Again, a fantastic place to live. It's part of Bavaria.
That's a beautiful part of Germany.
It's a beautiful, beautiful area.
Yeah.
Old Town Nuremberg is absolutely marvelous. We spent a lot of time just walking through, seeing the sights. My husband was a history fanatic, I guess you'd call it. So we did a lot of touring outside of all the cities we were at, looking at castles and fortifications and all kinds of things. So it was marvelous opportunity.
Did he also follow the say Napoleon's marches through these countries and that type of
Not so
history?
much.
Yeah.
Not so much. He was more into World War II battles, World War I, those kind of things. But anything historical, he's into.
Well, now you said he knew German from family. What
Yes.
was his family from Germany? Or?
His grandparents were from Germany, and they spoke German in their home.
So they probably had told him a lot about Germany as a kid, when he was a kid.
I believe they did.
Yeah. So that was an interest also, I'm
Yes,
sure.
yeah.
Tracking those things.
Yes.
Yeah.
We spent quite a bit of time. His sister was doing the genealogical, where everyone was from and their histories. And she had found several relatives in Germany that we visited at that time. His mom came over and we spent time in Cologne with these two relatives.
Yeah.
Just talking to them, meeting with them.
Now, Cologne is up in the northern part.
It's north of Frankfurt, yeah. About 2 hours. Yeah.
Okay, so you came back to the States from Nuremberg. Was there anything else special about Nuremberg?
I guess, again, I was very active in the Wives Club and also with the Parent-Teacher Student Association because of the children being in school. And I was president of the PTSA there for a year. Yeah.
So you, could you describe just a little bit about the school that you, each post you went to had a school for the children?
Right. Department of Defense has American schools overseas.
Yeah.
I think they've cut back considerably now, but at that point there were high schools and elementary schools in all the major areas
And
overseas.
how did you rate those schools?
Very good, actually. The teachers were exceptional because they really screened their abilities before they hired them for Department of Defense. I mean, they were civilians of the government at that point. So they went through the same screening that anybody does. And we felt the schools were very, very good. I think a lot of that is because I was so involved. And, they could open up to me and talk with me and were willing to work with me on issues, fundraisers and things for the school. A lot of parents did not live in government housing. So often there was only one car in the family and the wife was at home and could not get involved. And I think that's a detriment. But I found the schools very, very good.
Did you get to live in government quarters in all the assignments in Germany?
Not all of our assignments, but we did in all of them except, our second tour in Nuremberg, we lived on the economy, and then also in Heidelberg.
Okay. Well, from Nuremberg, you went to Fort Meade, back to Fort Meade, and at that time, Dan decided to change.
Right.
Why did he decide to get out of the Army and go into the civilian?
Well, there's an Army civilian program for intelligence officers, and I look at it as kind of quasi-military. Your first assignment had to be overseas. You had to have some language abilities, and they could move you whenever they needed you elsewhere. So it was very much like the military. It worked very, very similar to how the military does. Yeah.
But he decided to leave the military and go into this. What were some of the factors that?
Well, some of the factors at that point, there was a big drawdown in Vietnam, and a lot of people
that's right.
were.
Yeah. This is 75, 76.
Right. Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah. And he just saw it to his advantage to leave the military, take his military experience over to the civilian side. Plus, we wanted to go back to Germany.
and that assured him of doing that?
Yes, it did.
Oh, okay.
Yes, it did, yeah.
All right, so you go back to Germany.
Yes.
Back to Nuremberg.
And we went back to Nuremberg, which was a surprise because we had really just left.
Yeah.
Same people were there, so we met a lot of old friends. And in Nuremberg, at this time, we had to live on the economy because there was no housing in government housing for us. Okay. So we lived just outside of Nuremberg in a town called, Waldorf. No, wasn't Waldorf. Zierendorf, which is just outside. Yeah.
As a civilian, did you feel different, or since you had just left as a military and came back as a civilian, you were talking with the same people, and actually you were doing much of this, or Dan was doing much of the same thing?
Exactly.
It was probably he was just wearing civilian clothes. Huh?
That's right. Yeah, there was really no difference.
Yeah.
I think a lot of people saw us as different because we were no longer military, but we certainly didn't feel any difference.
Yeah, I kind of thought that.
Yeah.
Okay. Anything else about? Well, you decided to learn German there.
Yes.
Did you know a little German before? I mean, or just?
I had picked up enough when we were in Bremerhaven
Yeah.
and Frankfurt, so I could ask very simple questions.
Yeah.
And I could get along because most of the people over there speak German or
Yeah,
speak
speak
English.
Yeah.
Of course they speak German. But I wanted to learn more. And you could go to the German schools and take evening courses, but it wasn't quite what I wanted. And I had a friend who was teaching, she was a German, married to a soldier. She was teaching school to prisoners at the Army confinement facility in Nuremberg. And she asked for permission for myself and I think there were 2 other ladies to take German in her free time. So 3 days a week we would go out to the confinement facility and sign ourselves in and go through all these, you go through one gate, you're in an entry area and the gate locks behind you and then the other one opens up and you have to sign in and they look through your purse and everything else. It was very interesting. And then you have to walk through with an escort, walk through the halls downstairs to where the classroom is. And you would see the prisoners there scrubbing the halls or doing whatever. And when you walked by, boy, they snapped to attention and just, it was like you were a general officer walking through. It was really interesting.
Yeah. I'm surprised, I guess, that's where they would have a classroom for you to learn German. That there wouldn't have been another classroom or other
well, this was
avenues to learn German.
In the middle of her day, she had an hour or 2 free, and so instead of leaving and then coming back, she just stayed there, and we came in.
So this is sort of a special.
It was a special arrangement that she had done for the 2 of us. The prisoners that she was teaching German to had been convicted in German courts, and they were on their way to German prison. And the U.S. government wanted to provide them some language ability in German in preparation for their going, and that's primarily what she was there for.
Now this is 1980, so 78, and this is when you decided to take a job too,
Yes.
a real job.
A real job. Yes, I did. I took the civil service test, which was, very simple and just a little typing and that kind of stuff, and was hired as an engineering technician for the Directorate of Engineering and Housing in Nuremberg. And the branch that I was in, we were responsible for planning all of the new military construction throughout Germany.
Oh.
And there were 4 or 5 Americans, and then the rest were German. So we had to work with the Germans. I was responsible for reading the translated German reports that they had done to make sure they were accurate, and then just helping in the planning of these facilities.
Was there much construction going on at that time?
There was
This is
a
78.
lot. There was a
that right?
lot going on.
Why?
Barracks, storage facilities, new commissaries, new PXs. There was
We were going to stay for a while, huh?
right, and they were getting ready.
Yeah.
And, the facilities that the U.S. were in were all German, old German facilities,
Yeah.
and many of them were, even pre-World War II. Yeah. So they were doing a lot of construction to replace a lot of those things.
Okay, so now you moved down to Munich.
Yes, we did. And that was a wonderful assignment. We spent 5 years in Nuremberg, and then moving to Munich, we saw, again, old friends that we had known from years back. So it was kind of like old home week.
Now, did you have government quarters down in Munich?
We had government quarters because there were extra housing. Yeah. And we spent 5 years there. I, again, went to work, and I started working as an editor for one of the intelligence battalions that wrote order of battle reports and that kind of thing. Short term there, and then I went over and I worked for the civilian personnel department for a year.
As a personnel specialist?
As a personnel specialist. And then I had wanted to work in the intel field because that's where Dan was, and I knew that, you know, by moving around, I could always find some kind of
But
work.
you have you've learned a lot about construction. Not necessarily the details of construction, but the requirements and all that sort of thing.
Right.
And now you've learned about personnel, the personnel requirements,
Right.
which are all quite different. But you know, they're very important parts of the whole process.
Yes, they are.
Yeah.
Yes, they are.
Okay,
Absolutely.
now you wanted to be an intelligence.
Right. So,
specialist.
you know, working in personnel, I knew what positions were opening up, and there was one opening up where they were looking for somebody who was going to be around for a while. You know, not a military wife that perhaps would be leaving in, you know, a short period of time. And I applied for the position, and I was hired, and I worked as a collection manager, is what they called it. This was a very small joint service organization that debriefed people who were coming over from the East Bloc and writing up the reports. And
Yeah,
I was,
and that's what the collection means. It means collecting
Right,
intelligence
yeah.
from,
Yeah.
in this case, people coming over from the...
Right, yeah.
Did you have a lot of those people?
There were quite a few, yes.
were.
I mean, it was a busy, I was there for 3 years. It was a very busy 3 years.
Yeah. Did they have, I'm sure they had interesting stories about how they escaped. Is escape
Yes.
the proper term?
In many cases, it was.
Yeah, okay.
In many cases, it was. All the individuals that I worked with were language qualified. Many of them had been born and raised for most of their lives in the East Bloc countries, you know, Poland and Czechoslovakia and Romania, just to name a few. So they were all language qualified, and
By language, you mean English?
English and whatever that
German.
native language
Okay,
was.
yeah.
And they weren't looking at mainly where people escaped from. They were looking at what kind of knowledge did they have? You know,
Sure.
what areas did they work in? What could they tell the U.S. that would be beneficial?
That must have been very interesting.
It was extremely interesting.
Yeah.
Very, very interesting.
Okay, you go from there to where?
At that point, I moved to an upward mobility position, doing collection management also at the 66th MI Brigade, which was, you know, a promotion capability for me, and it gave me more exposure to all of what was being done as far as collection in Germany itself.
Okay, now you have another assignment in Heidelberg, similar, I presume.
Yes.
And now you come home to Washington in '92. And what do you do there? You get another job? Well, you stayed over in Germany for a while.
I stayed in Germany for a time because I liked what I was doing. I wanted to make sure I had a job back here in the States.
Well, what about the kids?
The kids were in school the entire time. They graduated from high school, from the Munich American High School, and came back to college. So
Where did they go to college here?
in George Mason.
To George Mason?
Yes,
Oh, okay. Did they find that their education was they were well prepared for college?
Absolutely. My son in particular, he had an English teacher that really forced the kids to, you know, to write papers, do research, that kind of thing. And he was a very, very good writer by the time he left high school. He also was able to take some college courses at the University of Maryland Munich campus, which was in Munich, while he was in high school. So he, you know, had a little bit of a heads up when he got back here
All
to
right. Well, I
to
just
school.
wanted to, because that was my impression that the
Right.
schools in those places were very good. and
Yes.
Therefore, there would be no.
Yeah.
Okay. We don't have but about 4 or 5, about
Oh my
4 minutes
goodness,
left.
really? I can't believe that. It's
you
gone
about
too
that.
fast.
All right. Now you get into some other programs back in the States,
Yes,
and they are special access
yeah.
programs.
In fact, I started working those in Heidelberg.
Did you? Okay.
Yes, when I moved up to Heidelberg, they said you're going to be working with these special programs, and I knew nothing at all about them. So it was a big learning curve when I got there, but it was very, very interesting.
Well, now, what do we mean by special access programs?
Special access programs are programs they can either be research and development, they could be operational programs, or they could be intelligence programs. And these are programs that are highly classified, very limited access to people who don't need to know the information.
So people with top secret clearance don't necessarily
That's exactly right.
get into
Yeah.
special. They have to be identified specifically.
Yes. You're identified specifically. There's some extra vetting that goes along with having access to those programs.
Okay.
You have to agree to polygraphs, submit extra paperwork than normally is done.
Okay, well, after you came back, you had assignments in Missile Defense Agency
Right.
and NGA.
Yes.
And I was interested that you actually got involved in the design or the building of our new building over here.
Yes, I did. I did. I had to review the proposals that were coming in. I was involved in the selection process of the contract from the security perspective.
And you retired in 2012 after
Yes.
35 years?
Yes, I did.
Boy.
Yep.
Listen, Betty, you've got some pictures of the places
Yes.
that you work. Can we show those? Where is this? Bremerhaven.
That's in Bremerhaven.
Okay.
That's the park in Bremerhaven. It's called Speckenbüttel Park.
Okay.
And that is, what harbor is that? That must be Monterey. And that's my two children on the wharf in Bremerhaven. I think they
Okay.
were 3 and 5 years old at that time.
Next.
That's the house we moved from when we came here to Front Royal. Or we were in Front Royal, we moved here to
Okay. So you thought you were going to settle down in Front Royal?
Yes, we did.
That looks like Heidelberg.
That's a castle. That's Heidelberg. That's a scene of Heidelberg. That's the old bridge in Heidelberg, Monterey, California. Again, Monterey. Monterey. That is the town hall or the city hall in Munich.
The Bremerhaven again?
No, that's not Bremerhaven.
What's this one? What about this
That's
one?
one I don't know. That's the Christkindlmarkt in Heidelberg. That's a scene in Nuremberg. And
All right, so
again,
we're back.
we're
All
back
right,
to-
well,
yeah.
thank you very much. I think we're probably out of time. Are we out of time? All right, well, thank you very much,
Well,
Betty.
thank you. This
It's
has
been a very interesting
this
tour.
has been fun.
Well, I'm glad. I hope
And it went so quickly.
it does. It
Yes.
goes so quickly.